This is what you signed up for this week's Star Citizen Live Industrial Gameplay Q&A. Was a good show. Torsten and Elliot were candid, thoughtful, and clearly passionate about where industrial gameplay is headed. But something stood out that I can't stop thinking about, not because it was new, but because of how many times it happened in a single hour. Combat came up, specifically the complaint that it shouldn't exist in industrial gameplay. And it didn't come up once, it came up 3 times. First, a formal pre-submitted question asked the devs to confirm how players can enjoy industrial gameplay without a need for arm protection or PvP readiness at all times, calling SIG's messaging on the topic mixed. Then mid-show, Commander Tanith fired off a chat message calling the inclusion of combat in industrial missions lazy. Then, right near the end, the Gaming Tribunal went all caps, stop adding combat into industry. 3 separate people, 3 separate moments. One show about mining and salvage. I was there to watch an industrial show. I wanted to hear about salvage improvements, cargo manifests, refueling missions, and what crafting is going to do to the economy. Instead, Jared had to stop and relitigate the same fundamental argument 3 times in an hour. He handled it graciously every time, more graciously than the situation deserved, but the fact that it keeps happening on show after show, year after year, means the argument never actually gets resolved. So let's try to actually resolve it. Not by telling anyone to leave, not by calling anyone a Care Bear, but by going back to the very beginning and asking a simple question: what exactly did you think you were signing up for? Go back and watch the pitch in 2012. Chris Roberts stood up and told the world what he was building. If you've never seen it, watch it. If you haven't seen it in a while, watch it again. Because the disconnect between what was promised and what some people apparently expected is staggering. The pitch opens on Chris talking about being an 8-year-old watching Star Wars and dreaming of being a hotshot pilot saving the galaxy. His touchstones are Wing Commander and Privateer, games defined by combat, by war, by survival against hostile forces. He isn't describing a logistics simulator with an optional skirmish mode. He's describing his life's work as a game designer who built his reputation making space combat games. The prototype demo he showed was a fighter cockpit, not a caterpillar loading dock, not a prospector mining interface, a fighter. He spent significant time walking through the physics of a ship designed specifically to fight. 4 thrusters on the bottom, 4 on top, fly-by-wire calculations running every frame to optimize combat maneuverability. He explained what happens when a thruster gets hit in a dogfight. He talked about how damage dynamically affects your ability to maneuver. He was giddy about it. The scale demo showed a carrier, a kilometer-long warship. Not a freighter, not a mining barge. A carrier full of fighters and crew built to project military force. He described Squadron 42 as a military campaign, branching missions, a tour of duty, flying sorties for the UE Navy. And then, this is the part people seem to have selectively forgotten. He said that when you muster out of Squadron 42 and enter the persistent universe, you're free. You can be a merchant. You can be a pirate. You can be an explorer. The freedom he was selling wasn't freedom from combat. It was freedom within a universe where combat is a constant, unavoidable reality. The pool is the galaxy you muster out into after the war. It was never going to be a spa. He said explicitly, I want to fight against real opponents in space, not just II. He talked about dynamic universe consequences, a living world shaped by player action, systems of risk and reward. There is no version of that vision that doesn't include conflict. The ships in the presentation? Military fighters, bombers, and capital ships. The tone? Epic. The music? Built for a war movie. The word combat came up repeatedly and naturally, the way you talk about something that's fundamental to what you're building. This was the pitch. This is what was funded. Stanton gave you a false sense of security. Here's where I want to be honest about something, because I think it explains a lot. For years, most of us lived in Stanton. And Stanton, despite its flaws and its griefers, functioned more or less like a high-security system is eventually supposed to function. Someone pirated you? Chances are a bounty hunter or a security NPC showed up, or the criminal just logged off. The loop felt relatively safe. You could do your mining runs, your hauling contracts, your salvage claims, and most days, nothing bad happened. That shaped expectations. Not maliciously, just naturally. If your experience of Star Citizen over several years has been, I mine rocks and rarely get bothered, it's understandable that you'd start to feel like that's the intended experience, that the risk was theoretical, not real, that the warnings were just flavor text. But that was never the design. Jared said it plainly in the Q&A, the law system isn't where it needs to be yet. Stanton was never meant to be a consequence-free zone. It was meant to be safer, not safe. The distinction matters enormously. The vision, as Jared laid out and as Rich Tyra outlined at CitizenCon, is a spectrum from Terra at the relatively protected core, through Stanton, out to Pyro, and eventually beyond. Risk scales with distance from the Empire's center. Reward scales with it too. You choose where to operate, and you accept the conditions that come with that choice. The Stanton bubble didn't promise you that combat would never touch you. Every ship in that system had weapons on it. Every pirate A that spawned near a jump point was a reminder. The risk was always there. It just didn't bite as often as it will. 3 times in one show, let's sit with that for a moment. 3 separate complaints in a single industrial-focused Q&A. Not a PvP show, not a combat show. A show about mining lasers and salvage buffers and cargo manifests. And 3 times, the conversation derailed while Jared patiently explained the same basic truth about what kind of game this is. His response to the Gaming Tribunal's all-caps demand was blunt no. It's all mixed, guys. That's the game we're making. He's right, but here's the thing, he shouldn't still be saying it in 2026. And the people asking the question, some of whom have been in this community for years, should know better by now. Because it's not just exhausting for those of us watching the show, it's actively unproductive. Stop adding combat is not a design suggestion. It's a rejection of the game's identity, and it closes the door on every conversation that might actually be worth having. Ask the better question. Here's what I actually want to know from the people who keep raising this. Not, why is combat in my game, but why does combat make your experience worse than it needs to be? Because those are completely different questions, and only one of them leads somewhere useful. If the answer is that combat and the flight model just aren't in a good state right now, then say that, because honestly that's fair. The current implementation is rough in ways that hit non-combat players especially hard. When an industrial player gets jumped, the tools available to defend or escape are clunky at best. That's a real problem worth discussing openly. What would a good, balanced, fair encounter look like for someone in a mole or a reclaimer? What should the risk to counterplay ratio actually feel like? Those are legitimate design conversations that go somewhere. If the answer is that you're soloing ships designed for multi-crew and losing everything to a dedicated combat player who outguns you with no real recourse, that's also a legitimate conversation. Science fiction is full of lone operators running ships that shouldn't be flyable by one person, and Star Citizen shouldn't be an exception just because a crew size is printed on a hangar placard. What does reasonable solo counterplay look like? How do we make large industrial ships less helpless without handing solo players God mode? That's worth talking about on Spectrum right now. If the answer is that high security space still doesn't actually feel secure because the law system hasn't caught up to the vision, guess what? The devs agree with you. Push for that. Make that argument loudly and specifically. Describe the encounter, the system, the circumstances. That's how things change. The point is that something in this game drew you in and kept you here through years of development. You watched the Citizen Cons. You saw the hype reels. You backed the ships. Combat was in all of it. So instead of fighting the game's foundation, fight for a better version of the parts that aren't working for you. It's only going to get higher stakes before we get to where I want to end this. Let's talk about where the game is actually going, because I don't think the people most opposed to combat have fully reckoned with it. Crafting is coming online, and when it does, resources aren't just cargo anymore. They become the raw material for gear, ship components, and weapons, with quality ratings that make certain resources significantly more valuable than others. A hold full of high-quality Quantanium won't just be worth selling, it'll be worth stealing. Then there's base building, player-owned outposts, player-constructed space stations. These aren't just decorative. They're going to be targets, they're going to be raided, they're going to require defense, or they're going to fall. The infrastructure that industrial players build with their salvage runs and their mining halls is going to become something other players want to take or destroy. The economy that makes industrial gameplay meaningful is the same economy that makes conflict inevitable. The game isn't becoming less dangerous over time. It's becoming more dangerous, with more at stake and more reason for other players to come after what you've built. If you're already uncomfortable with the current level of risk in a relatively underdeveloped Stanton, this future is going to be a significant adjustment. Better to start engaging with it now than to be caught off guard when your outpost gets bombarded and there's no Spectrum post that can fix it. What I signed up for, I want to tell you about a day in the verse that changed how I think about all of this. I was solo in my reclaimer, fully packed. A hold full of resources I'd spent a long session collecting, everything I'd worked for that day sitting in cargo, and I was making my way to a planetside outpost to cash out. Big payday incoming. A constellation started attacking me in atmosphere. If you've ever flown a reclaimer, you know what that moment feels like. You're enormous, you're loaded, and you're slow. Barely, moving through wet concrete slow. I had no escort, no wingman, no realistic way to outrun or outgun a constellation. So I didn't try. I pointed the reclaimer directly at the constellation and pushed the throttle as far as it would go. Loaded the way it was, I knew the physics were in my favor. I knew I was going to come out on top if this went the way I thought it would. The constellation pilot must not have seen it coming or couldn't maneuver out of the way in time. He lost control and hit the planet's surface. I survived. My cargo survived. The payday happened. And the feeling in that moment was one of the best I've had in this game, not because I won a fight, but because I found a solution inside the systems the game gave me. I used mass and momentum and desperation, and it worked. It also could have gone completely the other way. I could have blown up with a full hold and logged off with nothing. That was the risk I accepted the moment I undocked solo in a multi-crew ship in a universe where other players exist and have their own goals. That's what this game is. That's what it has always been. Not a guarantee of safety. Not a promise that your work will be protected. A universe with real stakes, real consequences, and real moments of genius and disaster that you get to be the author of. You signed up for that universe. So did the people who attacked you. So did every industrial player who ever lost a hold full of ore and logged back in the next day anyway. The question was never whether combat belongs here. The question is what you're going to do when it finds you. Start figuring that out and then come to the community with ideas. Because the stakes are only going up from here, and the players who learn to work with this game's identity rather than against it are going to be the ones building the most interesting stories when it finally gets where it's going. The too long didn't read version is, in a single industrial-focused Q&A this week, Jared had to stop and address complaints about combat existing in Star Citizen 3 separate times. 3 times, on a show about mining and salvage. That alone should tell you something about where we are as a community. So, let's be direct, combat was never hidden from you. Chris Roberts stood on a stage in 2012 and showed us a fighter cockpit, a kilometer-long warship carrier, and a military campaign. He said he wanted to fight real opponents in space. The pitch was funded on that vision. Every Citizen Con, every hype reel, every promotional video since has had combat front and center. Something in all of that made you open your wallet, and it wasn't the promise of a risk-free trucking simulator. Stanton gave a lot of people a false sense of security for years. That was never the design. The loss system isn't finished. The risk was always there, even when it didn't bite. If combat encounters feel unfair, clunky, or impossible to counter as a solo industrial player, say that. That's a real conversation worth having, and honestly, the current state of combat in the flight model isn't great, so you'd have a point. If you're soloing ships built for crews and feel helpless, argue for better solo counterplay options. Push for the loss system to actually deliver on the vision for high security space. Those are winnable arguments. But stop adding combat isn't a design suggestion. It's a rejection of the game's identity, and it wastes everyone's time. Also worth understanding, the game is only getting higher stakes from here. Crafting will make resources more valuable and worth stealing. Base building means player-owned structures that can and will be raided. This universe is becoming more dangerous, not less. That's the game. That's what we all signed up for. If something about that isn't working for you, get on Spectrum and tell us specifically what and why. The conversation is worth having. The one we keep having isn't.